how can we help folks who are white presenting, but they have a marginalized ethnic identity and claim they've experienced reverse racism, trying to make sense of a bicultural identity, but want to disregard the privilege that comes with white skin? This is a great question, and one that I'm noticing more. I was recently in a longer term intervention where after introductions, I couldn't remember who identified as biracial or white because there were 4 to 6 people who to me presented white, but when I listened harder, they identified as biracial. And so I have a couple thoughts on that. And I'm also very much still learning. And so I think as a field, I think a lot of us who are monoracial have a lot more to learn about people who are bi and multiracial. And I would start there. So if you identify monoracial, I was like, well, how can I learn more? And there are some identity development models. There also, I think, are some articles, maybe books coming out. I think that would be interesting. And maybe doing a book club in your organization so that folks that identify by multiracial might come, as well as other folk who are monoracial, and learn together. Because here's my experience is folks that are in intensive longer-term race interventions that I get to be a part of who are biracial, multiracial say sometimes that's the first time they've had a place to explore it. And so I think that's where our country is, and particularly higher ed and nonprofits. At least that's the folks we attract. So think about how can the whole organization get smarter in general. And then I always enter with where their pain is, because when people are in pain, they can't hear. When people are in pain, they can't engage. And when people are in pain, now they're marginalized. There's no way they're going to own their privilege. And so particularly with folks that are bi and multiracial, if I was working with a white person, I'd be saying, tell me more. And I think you're saying as a person of color, you're facilitating, you're having one-on-one. So I'll try to do that. And I'm assuming you're multiracial. You're monoracial. And so I would do remember the kind of peer horizontal hostility that is so there, not in the world, folks with darker skin being in so much pain about racism that it can be hard to listen to and hear the examples of folks who are lighter skinned or white presenting and believing that they experience racism. That's just a dynamic that I see in most every workshop I do. And so it might be talking about colorism and stories about, tell me about your family and how colorism, and then you tell stories about colorism in your family or friendship group. Calling it white privilege will probably be a trigger for them. I think it's white skin privilege, but I've had particularly one person, a friend of mine, every time I use that in a workshop, comes up with energy and asks me not to use it. And I still do and want to keep engaging the conversation about what that's about. But I notice I enter there and I'm learning not to. And so I would enter from the marginalized, the pain. And so tell me more. What's been your experience as? And can you tell me more about how you identify as biracial? Now, you framed it as ethnic identity. And so if they have white, quote, white heritage and Chilean, and you're coding it as ethnic, they might code it as racial, given, as you know, Latino, Latinx, Latina identities are so racialized in the US. And so I would just ask them more and build a relationship. And I'd ask them, so tell me more about your experience. And when have you experienced marginalization? When have you experienced microaggressions? Because they may not even know this language. Just listen and affirm and acknowledge and say, I've seen that happen other times. And then you might tell some stories. That sounds similar to what I've experienced, and tell some stories so that you're building that relationship. And they may be learning a bit more about what racism looks like for you and others in the organization, not as a yeah, but or a going one up, but just as a parallel. Here's some other experiences, because they may not be very aware about racism in general. And again, storytelling could be the way in. The other trap is, I've experienced reverse racism, so well, tell me more. And if I go white folk, they'll say, well, a person of color said they don't like whites. I say, well, what was that like? And how did you feel? What was the impact? And then this is the key thing someone taught me, is to explore not only the impact in the moment, but how often and the frequency. And say, well, first affirm, I'm sorry that happened. And I have seen that happen. And I can only imagine, how did it feel? And what was the impact? And I'm curious, how often does that happen to you? And they'll probably say, well, it happened, last year. And yeah, sorry that happened. And what I want to explore with you is how often that kind of a microaggression happened when you were in a privileged identity. Someone, if I go back to your question, someone who's biracial with light skin or white skin, white presenting. And how often, what are some of the situations you notice happen to people with medium or darker skin who are also biracial or multiracial? And see what their knowledge is. And they might be able to begin to, again, colorism, and notice the difference. But again, if you don't meet them where they are, explore that. Either they're in pain, resistance, shame, guilt, defensiveness. So those are a couple thoughts. A question I wondered about, again, this is all spaghetti against the wall, particularly as a white person. If we're talking about race, but anything, when I'm in the privileged identity, take it with a grain of salt and really run it through your body to see if these ideas will work in your context. But I wondered about asking about how did that experience re-trigger your other life experiences or generational experiences, trauma? And I thought about that because there are some folks I've recently got to be in the room with who were white and Native and Indigenous. And that's an area I need to learn a lot more about, because I think there are many more complex pieces to it that I have not taken the time to learn, with the generational trauma, the historical and current colonization. And then within each nation, I believe there's different ways of making sense, who's a member, who's not. And so there could just be lots of pain about, I'm not Native. And so go to the pain and be willing to listen and acknowledge and affirm and support. And everyone lately who presents white, knew they presented white, actually talks about white privilege, but they didn't want to start there. And so it took some conversations of being heard, acknowledged, realizing the racism they experience, the dynamics within family that are different. So there might be some whites in your organization who might be useful. First of all, if there are other biracial, multiracial folks in your organization that present white or have light skin privilege who could meet with this person, tell stories, connect, be a mentor. And then maybe, as you identify as a person of color, are there some white folks that might be willing to sit down with them and not do but you're white, but say, what's that like? Because I'm monoracial white and I have ethnic backgrounds, but all my ethnicity is white, European. And so that kind of relationship building might be useful. But I really like the idea of helping the whole organization get smarter about biracial, multiracial, because as a country, we are incompetent. You might be very competent, but as a country, we're not, and we're just beginning to get better at it. But you're getting multiracial with light skin privilege, and that's, people might name themselves Latinx, they might name themselves African American because of our one block. This because of our one drop rule. Folks can be very white presenting and passing and still be African American. Both parents are, quote, Black. And folks could have medium to light skin and be multiracial, Black, white, and could be very light skinned and white, Black. Asian American and white, Native and white, Middle Eastern. So I wish you all the best, and I'd love to have you back on a call to tell me what you're learning to help us all get smarter.